First of all, thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to Profound Conversations. And our conversation today is the new economic reality, socio-economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Let me give you a little bit of information about what Profound Conversations is. Profound Conversations is a listening and discussion space which brings together leaders into a conversation grappling with challenges of our time. Our goal is to use intercultural dialogue and community and organizational engagement to achieve valuable cultural, educational, economic, and policy outcomes. So welcome again to Profound Conversations. This is our second week of doing Profound Conversation. We launched last week, and last week we were engaging in conversation addressing mental health during these turbulent times. Today we're going to be talking more around some of the economics. So whether or not you've been impacted from a health perspective with the coronavirus, you have surely been impacted some way from an economic and from a financial perspective. We have people whose companies have been closed. They have not been able to move around the way that they need to move around. It's impacting low-income families in terms of how they're feeding their children, school lunches not being available, with schools being shut down. But it's having an impact on just about everyone from an economic perspective. And we're probably going to see even more of an economic impact in the weeks to come, in the months to come. We really don't know how long this is going to last. And when we start thinking about this issue as a global issue, the economists are saying that it's looking pretty bleak, that most of the developing world is going to go into an economic depression. So we then bring this down to us at a community level in the US, in the community and the family. And that's what we want our speakers to be able to talk to you today about. So let's look at it across the spectrum. How is it going to impact us at an economic level in the US? How is it going to impact our communities? How is it impacting our families? And how is it impacting us as individuals? We have three profound conversationalists with us today. And one is Jameel Johnson. And Jameel is the Associate Vice President at NASDAQ. And he formerly served as the Chief of Staff for U.S. Congressman Gregory Meeks and was the President of the House of Representatives Chiefs of Staff Association. And he was a staffer also for former Congressman Floyd Flake. And when Jameel talks, he'll give you a little bit more about what he does. We also have Andre Robertson, and he is the CEO of the Robinson Group, a collaboration of conscious community development, social enterprise, creative placemaking, and urban residential development practitioners focused on revitalizing Baltimore City. And Andre and I had a nice chat before we opened up the phone lines and learned a little bit more about what he's doing in Baltimore and how this crisis is impacting Baltimore. So I look forward to him sharing more with you around that. We also have with us Jamal Williams, who is the founder and managing partner of Red Dove Partners, LLC. And that's a firm with that has a unique and comprehensive approach to real estate and economic development. And he is currently focusing on a pioneering new discipline known as social architecture. So welcome to our panelists, to our second episode of Profound Conversations. Welcome everyone, and welcome all the attendees that's with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So now I've experienced a number of economic downturns in my professional life. I'll date myself a little bit here, but as a young attorney in New York, I experienced the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s and the early 90s, which was also coupled with the junk bond crisis. We also went through, I had a business and during 9/11 and felt the impact of that. By the time the whole real estate debacle came along, I felt like I was an old pro at weathering the storm through these crises. But this is looking and feeling very different. So I want for our profound conversationalists to give us some sense about where you think we are. Let's talk about the state of the union, and let's talk about the state of the unit, the family unit. So we want to cover both of those. We want to cover where we are as a country, where we are as a community, and what's happening at the family and individual level. And if you joined us last week, I started out by saying, this is where we are, folks. So I'm going to ask, any of you can jump in and just give us some kind of ideal about where do you think we are right now in the middle of this crisis from a financial perspective and an economic perspective.
This is Jameel. I'd be willing to start.
Sure.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Can.
Yes.
Okay. Well, here are my thoughts. I mean, one of the things that we're dealing with, and working for NASDAQ, we obviously operate the markets. So we're seeing particularly what's happening. We operate markets both here in the United States as well as overseas in Europe. The market in itself is seeing, and you talked about starting from globally and coming back home. So the markets are obviously experiencing unprecedented message traffic, unprecedented volumes across all asset classes. Asset prices have been fluctuating, mostly in downward trend. The market has lost all of its gains over the past couple of years. It has gone as low as where certain prices were 3 years ago. And when you can think of that in terms of a market that has had its upward trend, that is a lot of loss in a short period of time. And like you said, I myself, was growing up as a young adult, working in Congress, working in local development corporations, through all those crises that you mentioned. This is the worst because of the fact that in most of those previous crises, it really focused on a particular asset class that tumbled and then had a trickle-down effect on the rest of the economy. But it's not as if the entire economy was infected at the same time. Because of the need for social distancing, this is affecting the entire economy all at one time. And additionally, it is affecting all countries at one time. So when you think of it in terms of a crisis like you might have when a particular area of the country, for instance, has a bad storm, and power goes down, but then you have other utilities from outside of that area that will send help. We're in a situation where both nationally and globally, there's no one who can send help because everybody's in the same situation. And even though you may not have one of the areas that have stronger effect, it's affecting everybody in one way or another in order to try to keep it from getting worse. So this is probably the first crisis I have seen in my lifetime where every aspect of the economy, I mean, obviously some worse than others, but every aspect of the economy is feeling the effect at the same time.
Andre, how is this impacting like communities like Baltimore? Because a lot of times when we talk about the stock market, for those of us who may not have anything in the stock, we don't understand how this might impact the local communities. So what have you been seeing in your work in Baltimore in terms of the impact of this crisis from a financial perspective?
It's a very interesting question because, again, most of my work happens in communities that were already in distress and have been for generations, right? So it's the old adage that if, white people get a cold, we get pneumonia. All of us are kind of sort of in the stock market in some capacity because we are part of a stream of markets that are deeply influencing each other. Baltimore is a city where you can see in relief the history of structural racism quite in evidence, right? It's actually manifested itself in the environment currently because it's really the only city that hasn't been, especially in an urban core, it hasn't been massively gentrified. So you have extremely wealthy neighborhoods right next door to extremely poor neighborhoods in a city that's 70% Black and brown, but still experiencing 25, 35, 45% unemployment, depending on where you choose to place your gaze. So I think one of the things that we are looking at in the current crisis, because the multiple assaults that have happened that suppress Black agency in a city like Baltimore happen in every sector, right? So essentially, Baltimore is already a manifestation of what the world is experiencing because we are deeply traumatized, deeply damaged in healthcare, food, housing, education, the law, transit, and so on and so on. And those things are still made manifest because the urban removal that happened in most urban centers hasn't really happened en masse here. I'm from Washington, D.C. My production company is based in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I worked in Harlem for 30 years, Northern and Southern California, Dallas. So Baltimore's my seventh city doing this work in. And we were gentrified out of all of those cities because basically working with artists, I build theaters and galleries and restaurants and those kinds of things. And basically we're renting. And so the second we light up a corridor or a corner, then the landlord finds out kind of sort of how much we were making and pegs the new rent, $4,000 over that. So, my brother and I opened up an art gallery in a performance space in Emeryville, California, in an abandoned corridor that was an industrial zone. Pixar Animation moves in across the street from us and expands rapidly. And our rent went from $7,000 to $21,000 a month in one jump.
Wow.
So basically it's like whatever you can't afford, that's your new rent. So one of the things that we're seeing here on the ground is that Baltimore has a ton of distressed, very beautifully architecturally laid out city, very well designed city, but because of the generations on top of generations of discrimination, they're kind of locked in a permanent underclass. And we've seen that in many other places, of course, but that underclass is for the most part, like I grew up in Washington, D.C., they've been removed. You just don't see them downtown. It was like, I was at a meeting down there, it was like 30 minutes before I saw a Black man in a suit in neighborhoods that I had worked in as a young person. So we haven't seen the full effect of this global meltdown on these communities yet, but they're already distressed, they're already addicted. All the things that lead directly from like racism equals poverty, like the end, you don't need a deeper explanation of that. You can still find that manifest quite powerfully, visibly in Baltimore. So we really feel like we're that early part of a tsunami where the water runs out and everybody goes, oh, look, there's money raining down, there's fish, we can all pick it up off the ground, but you're not seeing the 3 mile high, flood of water, that wall of water that's coming at you. And then, having to predict how we ride out that in a community that is already deeply unhealthy. It's, I'm not hopeless, but hope is not a strategy, let me just say. So we're trying to shore up whatever local agency we can find because we're not really expecting very much help for long to trickle down from federal and state sources. So that's my cheery message for today. It's a sunshiny day today and we're still, trying to get stuff done, but it's a challenge when your real estate development depends quite heavily on capital and private capital, by the way. You can't really rely completely on state funding. So this is the moment where we're looking at the reset button being pressed across the board, but wanting to make sure it doesn't get reset for the old, inequitable, tragically marginalized system that that was existent for, since the beginning of Baltimore, really.
And I'm going to ask Jamal to jump in so that we can make sure we're kind of covering that spectrum of that global, the stock market, the community. And I know one of the things, Jamal, that you work with is just understanding that whole gradient of relationships. So I'll ask you to jump in here and talk a little bit about how do you see this crisis from a social gradient perspective?
So first, profound comments by both Jameel and Andre. The volatility is as we've never seen it before, and as you've expressed as well. And I think what I'm experiencing right now, personally, I'm a bit dazed and confused about where we are. Business has slowed for us. We've, of course, unexpectedly. And I think my condition is the condition of many other business owners and individuals across the country. We're all dazed. And we have different aspects of our practice in architecture, meaning place-based design. We have parts of our practice that focus on social innovation, and of course, finance and economic development. And we're still trying to get a handle on what it is that we're facing. I think it's Andre's profound sort of imagery and vignette that we're looking at a tsunami is an excellent statement. What we're experiencing, I think, right now is tectonic. And when shifts are tectonic, it's a difficult thing to manage. We have to stay calm and understand that the way through all of this is acceptance and some humility, and of course, belief in ourselves and our creativity. And so what we're trying to understand right now is really be patient with first staying healthy. And that's the interesting thing about this tsunami, if I can borrow that, Andre, this tectonic shift, is that there's nothing that we can throw at it other than what is needed by the public good. And what I mean by that is that this is health. And the impact, right? There isn't a bias on whether a person is rich or poor. So there's nothing that we can throw at as we usually throw at financial systems and markets, right? Something happens here, you add more pressure here, you throw more dollars here, you decrease this here, and so forth. And so, it's been what, 3 to 4 weeks, but it seems like months. So we're really trying to weather right now the social and psychological effects, and still at the same time think things through. I was on the phone this morning with a few of my development partners, just maintaining a focus on our existing projects, being hopeful that the credit markets and private family funds will be there, but we just don't know what the other end of this looks like. We're really not certain. So that said, our practice is focused as a development company is really understanding and pushing social innovation, social technology through a field that we pioneer called social architecture. And we do that with a number of colleagues, as you know, Andre and Kareem and Samuel in Atlanta, and we've got shout out to Rasul Shari and Mike Bonifer in California. We've been at this practice now, this work for about, I want to say 10 years. A work that was first coined as community as product, that understanding creating conversations and perspective where communities can understand that they themselves are a product. And what does that actually mean? Most often here, as you had mentioned earlier, we want to comment on communities and what's happening in communities. That we tend to make the distinction between neighborhood versus communities. This is a good segue. So to understand the social gradient and where we're sort of taking all of what's happening and occurring and looking at it on a social gradient. The social gradient, if I can map it out and if you can visualize it, we see that the gradient of self is another term for it. So every human being relates in social gradients, whether it's the womb as an individual, the womb, the family, the tribe, the community, society, state, nation, globe, the universe, the cosmos, the next life. Yeah, there are conversations about these sort of gradients in all our lives. And oftentimes we miss the distinction in our interaction, in our engagement, whether it's socially, business, theology, et cetera. And so the social gradient gives us another set of tools and lenses to really see the distinctions between conversations, approaches, and analyses of the things that we're engaging in. So we're really on the cusp of that with this current crisis. And it's slow for us. I mean, the first thing we recognize is, okay, we're bracing for, this is new. There's a new normal, and that is, and we have to raise our next generation thinking this way, that there's going to be another crisis, right? 7, 10, 12 years. So first thing we're saying, okay, so how do we design spaces? You had an example, and I'll finish up here, pass if you will. But we had an example in China where we saw some videos where the security forces were welding the doors on apartment buildings so that tenants and occupants wouldn't be able to leave as a safety measure. And so, we thought about that and realized that, wow, not that we would have to be that drastic in our approach, but we thought, well, maybe multifamily buildings, courtyards, the interior courtyards, because vitamin D is very important in any crisis, are going to be critical to multifamily designs. So when we start to look at spaces that are public spaces, we realize that the ventilation systems will have to be almost like a clean air lab to some extent if we're going to prepare for the future. So we're just still trying to look at what's going on and understanding. We have some tools in our sort of platform to look at things distinctively and maybe offer some innovative approaches to what would maybe new markets or new ways or resets and so forth. But it's so early. It's so early. We're still just trying to understand and get an orientation.
When I'm listening to all of your comments, one of the things I was going back to the conversation we had last week, where a lot of times when you're making these predictions, like if you're looking at the financial market, you're trying to figure out how the market's going to behave. In this situation, I think we got something additional going on because we also got to think about how people are going to behave. Mm-hmm. And this is a really new situation where we've putting people in these lockdown positions with a tremendous amount of fear, which caused us to have the discussion last week about the mental health and well-being. So how is it, how are we gauging and predicting where we might be when we take in consideration the human factor and how people might come out of this in terms of their own well-being and how they interact and how they want to interact with each other?
I think it will certainly expose the places in your systems that are the weakest. And there's no reason for us to expect that systems that haven't been tested at this level, we don't drill for pandemic crises, or for that matter, states of emergency, all with warnings. I mean, this happens over and over and over again, right? Bin Laden determined to do something inside of the United States and you go, oh yeah, that's nice, but let's wait until something really happens and then we'll just react to it. That hopefully in this generational shift between my generation, I'll hold the claim as the oldest person here. I was born in the mid-50s, and there have been many crises, some slow moving and some constant for people in the areas of the city that I care about. It's not that I don't care about wealthy people, and if their children were in trouble, we wouldn't do anything about that. But they allowed this crisis to be visited upon certain sections of the known Black world, for instance, for quite a long time. So is this the moment when we have all these other technologies that actually could be created? And now the normal thing that we would do in a crisis is we would gather. We would go and have a town hall and everybody would get together and we would decide what we're going to do about it. And the maximum number of people that we can probably put on these electronic platforms is about 100 people. And then that becomes a cacophony, right? So we have a new set of challenges in a neighborhood that we know didn't have broadband. Our children do not have laptops that are going to be sent home with their homework assignments on them. We knew all this stuff. We know that we could provide those laptops for about $50, and we did not do it. So now you have a whole school year gone. Everybody's going to have to repeat the grade. Let's be real, because the school year is gone. And so now we have to really consider all these things that we could have been working on all along. It's like the curb cut effect, right? If you had actually designed something to benefit the most people in society, you would be in a better position to make sure that the nurses had PPEs and masks. These are the basics. And we got them wrong because of certain other conditions, which we won't spend the whole hour talking about today, but these are known surprises. This is the expected surprise. Everybody told us to prepare for something like this, and we did not do that because our leadership was listening to other voices. So if we're at this place now where it's really not recoverable to bury 500,000 people all at once. We had to do it in the war. We had to do it when bombings happened, but we in this country have afforded ourselves a certain amount of somnolence about these kinds of conditions because they don't really happen here. We're not used to pandemics. Other
I think we lost.
folks, I got a call in, and that made me drop for a second.
Okay.
So I'm saying we've had to get used to things. We're going to have to get used to this new normal that Jamal spoke about, and part of the challenge, of course, is going to be reset for whom, new normal for whom. And that's what I kind of remain hopeful about, that I'm dealing with a generation that's an intergenerational, interracial, intercultural play with a lot of, Baltimore has a lot of colleges and universities. So we have quite a robust talent pool here. About 350,000 people come here for their education. But they are untethered to communities where they've been told, don't ever go over there where those people are. They literally tell them that when you get to Hopkins and certain universities, don't ever cross blah, blah, blah street. So now that we have something that respects no boundaries, if Prince Charles can get it, clearly anybody can get it, because that dude has no job and no work and he doesn't have to be anywhere. That means that anybody can be affected by that. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment where we start to be concerned about those other people and why are our children begging for dollars and washing windows. Maybe that's really the time that everybody can see, that's not really good for anybody. So that I choose to remain hopeful about the kind of other part of that's in the design of human beings, that sometimes we are truly at our best when things are worse, and that we can start to care more about those lean and mean places in society where it doesn't really make any sense that in this country with all this abundance and assets stacked in this corner, that will be hoarded and the other folks won't get anything. So, and that's just a choice. I just choose to be about the business of continuing to care for communities that have been marginalized and really decimated by the constancy of the theory of relativity, right? racism equals poverty, the end. You can add all the rest of the things in there, but this is definitely traceable back. These chickens have come home to roost. And so I think this is the moment where we can see how many people can we gather around the rebuilt society that we will have to do, because we'll have to rebuild it.
And we have Jameel on that's calling in, so I want to make sure we keep Jameel in the conversation. So Jameel, you want to talk a little bit about kind of that global picture, or maybe the role that the Federal Reserve might be playing in this?
Certainly. I do want to follow up on what was just said in regards to this crisis, and I'll get to the global issues too, is that we've often felt, people have a tendency to look at what has happened to them in their lifetime and feel that's what's always going to happen. Too often, because most of the wars in this country have been fought overseas. That even when we look at war, we look at it as, well, it's not that bad, because the U.S. has never experienced other than the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, in the last century, we have not really experienced war on our shores and the destruction that comes with that. So you end up not believing or thinking you have to prepare for it, in the same way that we have not really experienced, since the Civil War, political upheaval. To the point where, like, that's taking place in Iraq and Syria and the like. And so I think this crisis ultimately can be good for us in two ways. One is acknowledging the realization that we are not invulnerable as a country. Nations, empires have risen and fallen before. It happened elsewhere. It can happen to us no matter how much money you have or weapons you have, or so on and so forth. I'm a, God-fearing person, as a Muslim, a believer, and Allah has shown us, well, all the weaponry that you have, I can take something that you can't even see and bring you to your knees. So this should be humbling for us. Two, one of the things that has happened in past crises is that those who could afford it, and various systems, have become more resilient as a lesson from having to deal with particular crisis. My entire company and a lot of other companies that are still able to function are doing it without seeing each other, without, except on video, without seeing each other, without being in offices. In other words, we're able to do it without being on our normal real estate. And that was created by past crisis that said we have to have business continuity plans so that we can function. Even in a case like Hurricane Sandy, I'll give you an example. Hurricane Sandy in New York, there were broker-dealers that, if they could not get to their offices, they could not serve their customers, so the markets had to be closed. Now, that's not the case. And that was just 2 days. Now we're going into 3 weeks, and the markets are still functioning pretty much without flaw, because we learned lessons from the past. Now, that's on a larger scale, and that's happening in more developed countries worldwide. The question, and I want to bring it back to the local issue, is how do we develop that kind of resiliency in our neighborhoods and amongst our people? Now, what the Federal Reserve is trying to do, but they've used, as you know, after the 2008 financial crisis, they used a lot of their tools then, which is really, buying bonds, putting more money into the economy, lowering the interest rates so that hopefully people will want to invest more. But one of the things they said is that we used so much of it then, and it's become a normal part of the economy. And this is why Chair Powell was also looking at, we need to start raising interest rates, because we keep them this low and that becomes the norm. Then when another crisis strikes, we won't be able to use that tool again, because we're already pretty much at rock bottom. All right, we'll have to go to negative interest rates at that point in time. But what Congress is doing, as you know, is they're trying to put direct cash into the economy. They're trying to put it in the pockets of individual families. Of course, how long does $1,000, last, or $2,000, depending upon how they're going to distribute it. The agencies are still trying to figure that out, even though the legislation passed. Because it was passed so quickly, a lot of the actual implementation has to be figured out by the agencies, by Treasury, by HUD, by others, by the SBA. And remember, all of those places, their people are working at home too. Mm-hmm. So we put this work on a government that's also struggling. It's not like, 9/11, where it's like, well, the government is still intact, and City Hall in New York is still there. Albany was still there. Now, all those people that we're relying on are also home. And then the other question you have to deal with is, for some of those businesses, particularly those that are, no work, no pay type businesses, some of our friends, and Jamal knows them, and Kareem knows them, who own restaurants, are struggling right now because people aren't out shopping. Macy's is laying off 130,000 people. So you may be able to help people with both forgivenesses in regards to mortgage payments, not forgiveness, but delays in mortgage payments and other things. But if they can't go out and spend that cash, it really doesn't help. One of the reasons we have this downturn is because those of us who do have cash aren't really out spending it because we've been told to stay away from, a lot of these places. And an economy is just like, use the same term, an ecosystem. It's dependent upon itself. Once one part begins to fail, then the other parts begin to fail too, because it was all interdependent. So the question becomes, how soon are the steps that are being taken now going to give us an opportunity to reopen the economy? And the question becomes, both individually and from a community basis, how can we do like some of the larger players on a local level and become more resilient in a sense of we've learned from what has happened. So what do we do? As individuals, do we understand the importance of saving better? As small businesses, do they begin to say, if we can't open, how do we still get our product to market? I can still so in order of food, so I can still be open in this particular time and manner, so those who do have money can still spend it. What do we have for our employees? What systems have we put in place from a government point of view, from an individual point of view, for those people, if they're not working, they have, like people have talked about, a universal income. I'm not necessarily advocating that in general, but maybe that's something that should automatically be prepared for in cases of emergency like this, where, yes, I'm a normal working person, this, that, so on and so forth, but I can't work right now because of this crisis. It's okay. You know, go online, do this, universal income. How often do we look at schools? Matter of fact, at NASDAQ recently, we were talking about the issue of someone asked, as part of what we call our global link of Black employees, we had a function during Black History Month, and someone asked, because we have to have the best equipment, that means we change it in and out a lot, fairly frequently. What do we do with that equipment, and can we then provide it to poor schools, like the brother brought up earlier, so that all those students have equipment? This should be something that should really be pushed, so that you don't have a situation of I can't learn because I have no access to learning. Early on, one of the public schools, I think a representative of public schools, has said, we could look at doing online learning, but that is going to leave poor people behind who don't have online access, which means we're just going to make it worse for them if we let everybody else move forward and they're left behind. So I look at it, I'm also very, politically involved with an organization called Prince George's County Muslim Council. One of the things that's going to come up for us, and I'm going to make sure it does, is looking at it from a school system for government point of view. What are we going to do to make sure, working with the business community and the government, to make sure on an education point of view that the poor of us have access to online capacity if the schools have to shut down again? If we don't learn a lesson from this, then we deserve whatever happens to us.
Now, one of the things you said, Jamal, is that captured my attention was a business continuity plan. And, you know, that's something I've worked in healthcare for years, and we always have to have a business continuity plan in place. It's updated regularly. And as Andre said, that running those drills, you do run the drills of what do you do in the event of emergency. We know hurricanes come. You don't have your critical systems all in one place. You're having them on different coasts. So if a hurricane is hitting here, you at least have a critical system somewhere else that's not impacted by that. So how, you know, so I found that really interesting to just think about it, even from our business perspectives, from a community perspective, and from a family perspective. How do we put that in place?
So that was,
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Jamal.
that was, just by the way, that was Jameel that made that statement about business continuity plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you want to answer that, Jameel, or?
Yes, that's very true. Like I said, one of the things that we had to do was immediately look back at our plans and say, okay, what do we do in this circumstance? So we have an entire organization, except for those who literally have to go in from time to time to make sure the servers are running. We have a whole system of people who can work from wherever location that they are. You know, so the issue is, when it comes to the first thing you have to have in putting in what they call a BCP, or a business continuity plan, is you have to be willing to take the time to say, it's just like with fire drills. We have to take time out to focus on this. So many small businesses and individual families, just like how many individual families actually do a fire drill at their house? You know, most people don't think of it until it happens. So the first thing is commitment to the realization that anything can happen in the future. So what are the likely things that might happen, and what are some of the unlikely things that might happen? And you look at them and list them. What if I'm out of work? What if I can't get to the job? What happens if, you know, stores close? You have to take a look at a listing of things and say, if A happens, how do I do B? Just recently, I was taking a class called Harvard Business Online Entrepreneurship Essentials. And one of the things that they talk about there is, when it comes to planning, is that you look at, okay, here's what I need to go right in order for this to function. But in each of these aspects, what happens if this goes wrong, that goes wrong, or that goes wrong? What do I do? What is my plan B when plan A goes wrong? And what is my plan B if something I haven't considered goes wrong? So that's the first thing that we have to look at, both as individuals and companies and small businesses. Large businesses do this all the time. Small businesses probably do not. Small business just hope that when the doors open, people will come in and they'll pay their money, or I'll get this next contract, and so on and so forth. We've got to take a look at what are the individual aspects. I already know what it takes for me to function. So I have to take account of all those aspects, what it takes for me to function and be successful, and say, what happens if one of those things goes wrong? And when one of those things does go wrong, how do I react to it? And what have I put aside to plan for it when it does go wrong, as opposed to assuming everything is going to go right and then taking all my resources and using them in the present day as opposed to the future. And one of the things I also want to recommend to everyone, if you are able to, and I know not everybody is able to, one of the things that sophisticated people do is they realize in a crisis that in a crisis there is an asset sale, right? All assets are for sale during a crisis. You know, just like around Christmas time or the new inventory is coming in. So one thing that we have to learn as a people is that if we have the ability, if we have the resources, invest in assets now while they're for sale, as opposed to waiting until everything is fine and all those who have real cash have purchased all the assets at a discount. And this helps us strengthen our communities so we're in a better position to help those who don't have.
Now, one of my experiences is just working, when I practice law, was being able to work with people to have them think about everything that could possibly go wrong. Because that's the way you build a strong business continuity plan. You got to actually conceive of what can go wrong. No one conceived of 2 planes hitting the towers. So even the insurance policies weren't written in order to address that issue. So there were big debates over, is this 1 claim or 2 claims? Because we never imagined them both happening together. So how do we begin to pool kind of resources and kind of that collective mind to be able to think about all the possible things that we as families, as community, as businesses need to plan for? Because when we do that on an individual level, there's going to be a lot that we miss.
Well, I think one of the things that can be critical to also begin to think about is that what happens when failure is catastrophic? Not like, well, if this happens, I'm going to do this. What if all of your systems go down? Or what if all of the power goes out? I mean, those are the kinds of things, not just for 2 days, but goes out and is not rebuilt because Puerto Rico doesn't matter. Here, take some paper towels. We do have to think about those kinds of elemental corruptions that you can't really glaze over, that maybe the opportunity that should not go to waste in this current crisis is really looking at a level set that says how much of this is going to always keep occurring over and over again if in fact all the lifeboats are actually at this end of the boat and that everybody else is trapped below deck. In the current crisis that we have here in communities, generally in organizational culture, when communication is low, trust is low, and you don't have a strong network of communication in most Black communities. There are very few institutional presences outside of the police department. If people can't gather in church, we got a lot of churches, but they can't gather in church. So we have no place where the information is being disseminated. So right now, communication is very, very low. And what rushes in when communication is low is innuendo and rumor and I thought, and the virus is killed off when you don't really worry about it. Heat kills it, and then the president's saying the same normal, crazy stuff. So all of your systems are kind of out of place. So one of the things that we're thinking about is that what happens when your traditional hierarchical leadership structure is damaged to the place that not only is the captain maybe gone overboard, but all the second mate and all the rest of the mates are gone too. And you don't see any of those people in community, just the people who have the guns are here, and they're guns on both sides in these communities because they allowed those things to flourish for a long time. So it's not possible to set aside something when you're on subsistence in the first place. And that's really what we're really having the opportunity to look at in a city like Baltimore, because the disparities are so enormous and they've existed for so long that you have a system that's probably not worth preserving in the old way that we think about preserving them in the first place. That we really should be looking at how in this moment do we create a system that is just. How do we get together with people like Jamal, who are design thinkers, and if we give Jamal the magic wand for a little while, he could say, well, if you really wanted a just and fair and verdant society, you would think about it this way and start to rebuild around that, because almost all of our systems, they're not broken, they're fixed in place, permanently marginalized sections of the city that we just came to accept that these people are going to be always poor. And so if in fact, yes, food is in the grocery store, but if they don't have money to buy the food, well, I'm a student of history, and if you look at revolutions, they all begin in hungry bellies, no matter how high the wall or the fence is. So this is the moment where we may want to think about not lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis, but what would happen if all of the systems seem like they're permanently fixed in a broken, like the normalization of deviance, right? These are the things that bring the whole kettle of fish down. And if you have a system that is run by liars who are going to lie about the corruption and pretend that it doesn't exist, you really won't be able to have very much of a thing to press the reset button on. So that's really what we are really trying to work out amongst a broad swath of individuals who are deeply committed to justice, equity, and inclusion, but don't really have the means of control over the markets in their hand. So if it will press a reset button and assume that 25% of the people are just going to starve to death, those are bad assumptions to run your scenarios on. So that's kind of what we're wrestling with, and really considering that this is the time to be hyper local, right? I have a block that's in distress. It doesn't really matter how well they're doing 3 blocks away. If this block is in distress, it's going to bring that down with it. And I think people are really starting to see, oh, yeah, I actually am in a safe neighborhood, but I heard the gunfire, and it's a block away in one direction or another. So we're hoping to continue with that, to build trust in a neighborhood that has very little of it, not internally, and doesn't trust its systems because its systems are not present.
Now, how do we think this kind of new reality, this post COVID-19, how do we think this is going to affect all of the systems and the relationships? What is it going to look like post COVID-19? And I see Jamal smiling, so I'm going to ask you to take that one.
Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing here is, right, there are layers to this. There are serious layers to all of this. The social gradient allows us to look at these distinctions and these layers and search and mine for distinctions. Here's the immediate thing that comes forward for me. We're in a climate right now in the country, and I'll just deal with our nation first, because other nations have very interesting approaches to deal with their issues. And we've seen the numbers coming out of Britain and some of the Scandinavian countries of what they were doing for their citizens, guaranteeing percentages of their incomes and so forth. But while those countries are dealing with their own crises around immigration and other issues and so forth, and fluctuating markets, Brexit and so forth, and what that means to the European economy, one of the things here that we're dealing with is, and it's part of the issue, but because we're so concerned about our survival in terms of our health day to day, we're not discussing it. But there's a climate of eroding etiquettes, right? Where you have a leader who lack the etiquettes, and in those sort of erosive environments, you have a lack of trust, as Andre says. And when you're in a crisis like this, as a unit, the thing that you need most, especially if you're going into battle, is trust. Mm-hmm. And so that's like the when you're talking about relationships and what comes out the other end. And so the to some extent, as Jameel mentioned, the humility, the idea that we're vulnerable and that we have to find resiliency in what, right? What is it? And for this system, it's been capital. It's always around capital, not the issues, what I call the social technology, issues of understanding ourselves as operational, that we can be operational as human beings. We think, but there's a warmth to us. So, how do we deal with the existing climate or this crisis in the existing climate? As you can see from the media and some of the leaders in this country, it hasn't been favorable at all. So I think, again, so we're in that mode where it's like, I wake up and I just stay, accept the reality of where we are, and that it's going to take time it takes focus and time to figure out what's happening and what we should do. But I think the one thing to come out of the other side better, we have to educate ourselves and educate others. So this is a great time. So if we study history and we say, well, what was it? Was there a resiliency in the society during the Great Depression? What were those things that were there? And people talk about how they work together, and we're hearing a lot of that today, right? People are talking about how their online communities are developing, their neighborhoods and communities are shifting in some neighborhoods, and we have to be aware in other neighborhoods they lack the resources Andre mentioned. But I think for us, from the social innovation aspect of our business, we're looking at like just helping people understand, like, okay, there's a shift here. And the first thing we think about as developers, so we're already making a move in certain markets with investors and about where we think the asset prices will drop. And we know where those markets are, but where we see that the demographic shift, or where people are just, the population is moving to those neighborhoods or those cities, they're going to happen, right? But again, we just don't know for sure now, because just the other day I woke up and I was thinking to myself, man, I should have actually moved to that farm 10 years ago when I was thinking about it. So we're not sure where people think is going to be, but of course that's a lot of this is controlled by demand, demand for work and so forth, and that's why the cities have been growing, right? So we have urban densification and so forth. But so the thing is, I'm trying to look at just like where we are today in the world in terms of, let's say, concentric circles of relationships of business, technology, and as you asked the question, behavior, right? Business, technology, and behavior. And where they intersect is that point of innovation, right? Where do we find the new ways of culture being, new ways of creating technology, efficiency, and new ways of looking at profit, right? Whether it's B Corp, nonprofit, C Corp, et cetera. And that's part of the issue right now. Listen, they're talking about sending out $10,000 checks. I don't know if Jameel is the finance man for sure, so if he can do the math real quickly. But I was like, you mean we can't spend $1 billion on ventilators? Like the government said, no, it's too expensive. So I was like thinking to myself, I wonder if like everyone that received a $10,000 check just decided to give $1,000 and we finance it ourselves, right? And then charge it. It's really not difficult. It's just how we look at capital in markets and how and that government, how we treat ourselves, each other. And so, part of what we would like to do is find a way to have those conversations in the spaces that we can have them in, first and foremost. And so some of the ideas, there's been ideas with some of my colleagues that are in education, for example, they're consultants, education consultants, and they're looking at the, with the banking institution, interestingly enough, they're looking at how they focus on creating very specialized homeschooling, the online homeschooling component that we're dealing with, that we're embracing, and now how do we encourage it and then kind of focus it on certain types of a certain type of education. So out of this crisis, we'll develop a thirst for economics in the next generation and to fix the system, right? So when you talk about the other side, how do we segment it? Are we talking about 3 to 5 year to 10 year? That's how it's normally looked at. Or we're looking at 20-year tranches, generational tranches. So how do we fix it? So when you start helping people understand, business, those concentric circles, And then then you take that concentric circle and you put it along the gradient. What are the opportunities along the womb and the family and the tribe and community and society levels to look at businesses and their impact along the gradient, or the communities they serve along the gradients, and understand that. And one other thing I'll say, so that's kind of how our initial perception about what to look at. And it's very, it's a deep dive.
I'm going to ask you to pause for one moment. Hold that thought, though. I know we're about 2 minutes after 5, and just in case some callers need to get off, if the speakers would stay on for a few minutes, I would love to have you finish the point and open it up for some questions. If any caller does have to drop, this session is being recorded. You are welcome to throw a question into the chat box that we can answer if you have to drop off. But if you can stay on, please hang on with us for a few minutes. And if we can stay on maybe another 5 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes to take any questions that people have. So I just wanted to say that before people dropped off. Okay.
Sure.
So
I'll conclude it. So I'm hopeful. All right, I'm hopeful, and about the fact that life will continue. I don't think we're at the end. That there is possibilities for some positive outcomes. I know most folks are trying to return to normal, and that means profits over people, and that's a problem. We've got to fix that. So in a sense, I'm looking to see where are the opportunities to make at least some small gains. Whether, as Jameel said, there are acquisition of assets that we can put into play for our folks, or whether there are long-term sort of innovations that will help our generational thinkers, economists for the future. So we're hopeful about some positive outcomes, but we're dealing with the immediate psychic shocks right now, so to speak.
all right, thank you. I see we have a hand up. Erica, can you open the line up for, I think it's Hakeem?
Yep. Let me see if I can get it right now. Hey, Hakeem, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, please go ahead. What's your question?
Have any guidelines been put in place that would allow for each organization to be able to generate funds based on the things that we know need to be done here in the urban community?
Let me say this one thing right quick. You have a stage 4 piece of legislation that's coming up, in which people will be able to, where they're going to be looking how to further assist the economy. The last thing that was passed was called stage 3. This one is known as stage 4. And that'll happen when Congress goes back into session. They will be looking for ideas on where, particularly on the Democratic side, where they can put money into places and organizations that can help average people in the long term. So what I'm going to recommend in that is that if you're saying, here's what I can do to help shore up people's lives over the long term, in this case, seniors are always sympathetic. You need to reach out to your legislators and say, particularly on the federal side, I think you said you're out in Kansas. Is that what you said?
Kansas City, Missouri.
If so, you're talking about, Missouri. So you got somebody who's, high up level, a subcommittee chair on financial services in Mr. Cleaver. You've got Mr. Clay out there, who's also a subcommittee chair, and, say, hey, look, here's what I can do. You need to put some language in this that does this. And particularly now it's important while you've got Ms. Waters as the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, and you have Ms. Pelosi as the committee as the Speaker of the House. So we got to take advantage of this opportunity.
Okay. Senator Pelosi actually has put forward a measure to increase the Social Security benefits for the seniors. And I understand that it'd be a great help for them. But what we're talking about is outside those limited funds that they expect to give to the elderly.
So, Hakeem, one of the things that, again, in our innovation thinking, we're working in Philadelphia with some partners and developing community groups there. So sometimes it's tough sometimes to solve the immediate problem because, we're working with old products and systems, right? So you're right. You get, Social Security is one source. So I think if I understood your question correctly, you were asking about sort of developing a new product type of business that would allow for linkage and connections to seniors as part of the community, but how do you turn that how does that create a capital source or become revenue source, right? Am I correct?
Yes.
Is that kind of where you're going?
Yes, sir, exactly.
So we had put together a program, a development program, to address an issue like this in Philadelphia. It's still sort of a white paper for us, and it's called what is it? So it's titled. So it's the idea of sort of an inclusive ecosystem that embraces age 0 to 100 or 200, right? And the idea was to design a civic community center in the center of this community, this 3 acres, 5 acres of land, 7 acres of land. And then we would have senior housing, affordable housing. In the civic building, it's attached to a library. And so what happened is, what we were thinking is, so now what we do is we would source the seniors and see them as sort of knowledge-based component. So if you were to do a survey or a asset mapping or asset data collection of their education, their background, their training, we would find that some of them are former teachers, technologists, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them still have linkages to their universities. And so we knew that with affordable housing, the folks that we were addressing in terms of their housing needs and requirements, and there would be a clinic nearby, a part of this development as well, that the mothers or parents would be away working, long hours is generally doing this economy. You generally have to do in this economy. And that the seniors can substitute at the civic center and in the library and sort of mentoring and being tutors to those children. And so then there would be some sort of stipend and set aside. So we were working with the policymakers and so forth to look at this new concept. And it was embraced. It was embraced by the local councilwoman, and it was embraced by 2 of the state senators. This concept of, I apologize, and the name, I just can't bring it to mind right now, but it was sort of civic. It was a collaborative civic community town hall. So that's one of the things I think so in Kansas, in Missouri, you find some, social thinking, community-based developers who are interested in a holistic model. Perhaps we can help you and have it, further the discussion and help you with your thinking and sort of collecting some folks together to see if you want to put a project like that together.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks all of our profound conversationalists. I hope everyone that tuned in got something from this conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and hope you will join us for our next profound conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.